Hello, Dr. Crosswhite here. I'm going to introduce you to the idea of core concepts and those concepts that are found within the field of physiology. Okay, so I'm going to give you an introduction to what core concepts are, how I utilize them in my classroom, how they can benefit students. I'll briefly go through a few of the core concepts that you'll encounter in anatomy and physiology. Not all of them, but some of the major ones. And then I'll finish it up with a conclusion on what you can expect to encounter with these core concepts in my classroom. So what is a core concept? What do I mean by that? Basically, it's a big idea. You guys are familiar with the term, a big idea. So many courses, many disciplines try to utilize, well, what's a big idea or theme within a discipline? But basically, a core concept or a big idea is something that is applicable to many subdomains within the field. So it's transferable, let's say, within the discipline of physiology, or transferable within biology. Core concepts provide coherence or structure to the domain. They increase one's retention of certain concepts that are repeatedly encountered when studying a discipline. They also can provide tools for helping individuals solve problems, aka it's a tool to help advance a student or even an instructor's learning. Lastly, these big ideas or these concepts, the ultimate goal is that they provide utility for use in the future. Okay, so you can apply these ideas outside of the domain or beyond the classroom, basically. So most disciplines have core concepts. It's no surprise. Chemistry, biology, psychology, etc. Not just STEM classes, but physiology, they have their own core concepts. And some of those may actually overlap with other STEM courses that you've encountered. However, what will be different is the priority and emphasis that are placed on certain core concepts. Okay, so how do these core concepts apply to you as a student? So my ultimate goal in utilizing this approach in my classroom is to increase a student's success in understanding the discipline. My hope is that when you finish this course is that you have not just taken exams and received a grade, but you have learned a certain concept, a certain concept within the discipline, and you can take that with you into your future. The other goal is that I hope it can selectively reduce the body of knowledge that is required of you. Okay, so you can learn a core concept and how it works or how it operates, the basics of it, and then as we encounter new systems, hopefully it lowers that burden of new knowledge you have to acquire. In another way they can help you is that core concepts can focus on generalities and the information that is most transferable. For example, concept of flow down gradients, this can be applied to both the flow of blood and the flow of gas within the circulation. Okay? I'm not trying to dumb down or generalize concepts, but these core concepts are general in nature so that they are transferable. And the last thing is that hopefully they can provide a scaffold for learning new material later, like I said earlier. Frameworks for future learning, not just in another course, but also outside of the classroom, help you solving complex problems, and ultimately 5 years from now you're going to forget details. You're not going to remember details of everything that we discuss this semester, but hopefully you will retain the big ideas of physiology, these core concepts. So how will I use them in my class? Core concepts, obviously this video, I'll leave it posted, you can refer back to it as much as possible. I will start introducing core concept worksheets that can be used in class, out of class, as well as I like to emphasize just the core concepts into my lecture, ask you questions based off them, have you do work, group work, etc. Okay. And then finally, exam questions. Since I'm priming you guys, introducing these core concepts in these worksheets, some questions on their exams may be related to the core concepts that were covered in certain chapters of the material. Okay, so let's briefly go over those core concepts in physiology. So real quickly, since I use this video for both Anatomy and Physiology 1 and 2, you may be encountering this as a student in Human Physiology 241. So what is physiology? Obviously, literally, or I should say the definition of physiology is literally, it means the knowledge of nature. But the modern day understanding is that it's the study of normal functioning of a living organism and its component parts, all the way from the atoms to the environment. This is the definition from your textbook, from Silverthorne. Another way of looking at it, it's the study of the vital functions of the human body. Okay. But by nature, physiology is a very integrative discipline, probably more integrative than other disciplines you've encountered so far in your education. But the moral of the story here, integrative, if you change a parameter in one system, it's likely going to influence one or multiple other systems. That's what I mean by integrative. Makes it challenging for students. The author of your textbook, Silverthorne, she introduces this idea of core concepts as well, but she calls them themes. She introduces you to 4 themes in chapter 1. They are listed here. However, there are more than 4 themes or core concepts in physiology. There's about 15 that physiologists agree on, so I'm encouraging you to move beyond Silverthorne's 4 themes because we will throughout the semester. Okay, so like I said just a moment ago, these are the core concepts that physiologists generally agree on. Good news is I'm not going to go through all of these. I'm just going to go through a few of them because these are the ones that we're most likely going to encounter in 241 or 242, and those I've just denoted here using the red asterisks. So there's about, 6 of them that I'm going to briefly go through. It doesn't mean the other ones are not important. It just means that in 241 and 242, we're less likely to encounter those. So the first one, homeostasis. Internal environment of the organism is actively maintained, constant by a function of the cells, tissue, and organs, and is often organized into negative feedback. What I mean by that is negative feedback maintains homeostasis. Moral of this story is we live in a constantly changing environment, so our body has to adapt. If we do not maintain homeostasis, problems can occur with our body. Don't confuse homeostasis with stasis or unchanging. True biological systems are always in flux, similar to our body, so don't think that it's unchanging. Failure to maintain homeostasis, like I said a moment ago, can result in pathology or maybe even death. Okay. And then, like I also mentioned a moment ago, homeostasis is often maintained by the use of negative feedback, where the output of a system is fed back in a manner that tends to reduce output fluctuations. So the output of a system shuts off the system. Okay, so here's a diagram from Silverthorne's chapter 1, illustrating the concept of homeostasis. I'm not going to cover it right here because we will cover this in class, but you can take a look at this in the meantime. All right, the next core concept is cell membrane. And what I mean by this is that all cells, they have a plasma membrane, and these are very complex structures, and they actually, the cell membrane is what determines what substances enter or leave a cell. So they're not there just providing support and cushioning to a cell, but they're really important. They're regulating what's passing in and out of a cell. So every cell has a cell membrane, not only creates that barrier, it's composed of a variety of substances, lipids, protein and carbohydrates. Okay, this gets back to the fluid mosaic model, but basically the cell membrane, in addition to creating a barrier, it's really important for signaling, transport, and several other processes vital to the cell. So cell communication between cells. It's also important for the transport of nutrients, many reasons that we'll encounter in 241 and 242. Here's an example from your book. This is illustrating the composition of a cell membrane and the fluid mosaic model. Again, I'm not going to go over it right now because we will go over this in class, but you can take a look at this in the meantime. The next core concept is cell-cell communication, or just cell communication. Basically, the function of the organism, of an entire organism, absolutely requires that cells pass information from one another to coordinate activities. So it's communication. Cells have to talk to one another. A variety of mechanisms exist for our cells to talk to one another. Those include endocrine or hormone signals, neural signals, including action potentials, okay, or a variety of other chemical signals that are not hormones, paracrines, autocrines, and these are often utilized in conjunction with what's called a cell surface receptor, which is a type of protein, or which is composed of proteins. But again, we'll encounter all of these throughout 241 and 242. The next one is energy. We require energy. We have to take in energy in order to survive. So the life of an organism requires constant expenditure of energy. So we have to acquire, we have to transform, and we have to transport that energy throughout our body so that all cells so that all cells receive the necessary amount of energy that they require in order to stay alive. Okay. When we talk about energy, we really border into the biochemistry territory with metabolism and glycolysis, citric acid cycle, etc. Okay, but in physiology, yes, you'll encounter those metabolic pathways, but in terms of what you'll encounter the most as far as energy is adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, as it's the main energy molecule for the cell. So here's a picture of how our cells, most cells produce ATP production. Over on the left, I'm not going to go through it. Over on the right is an actual molecule of ATP. Again, I'm not going to go through it at this time because we will have plenty of time to go over this later. The next major core concept is this idea of flow down gradients. So this is, and I want to draw your attention to the transport of stuff. So stuff can be a variety of different things: ions, molecules, gas, blood, fluid, etc. We have to transport a lot of stuff within our body, and it's a central process at various levels of organization. And what I mean by that is within a cell, but also within the entire organism itself. Okay? There's a simple model that can be used to describe some of these physiological processes, and that is bulk flow. Okay, so bulk flow refers to the transport of stuff. An example of bulk flow: circulation of blood. So our blood flows from an area of high pressure to low pressure. Without that gradient, it would not move. Okay, that's an example of bulk flow. Respiration: this is a similar idea of bulk flow. Gases diffuse from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. It's movement according to bulk flow. And then, like I said, within cells, diffusion of materials within cells, compartments, fluids, etc. is an example of bulk flow. Okay. Another example of flow down gradients are membrane-bound transporters. Basically, materials often have to cross a cell's membrane, and they have a variety of mechanisms to accomplish this. Some are very specific, some are very general. But as an example of this, the sodium-potassium pump transports sodium and potassium across a cell's membrane. There are ion leak channels, a variety of different methods. Again, we'll have plenty of time to discuss this in class. Okay. The last thing I want to emphasize about flow down gradients is not the same thing as mass balance. Okay. So here is a graph that's illustrating the concept of flow down gradient, and it's showing blood pressure. Again, all that I'm trying to illustrate here is blood is moving from an area of high pressure here, and it moves to an area of low pressure. Without this gradient, blood would not flow. Okay, I just mentioned mass balance, that flow down gradients, bulk flow, it's not the same thing as mass balance. Okay, so mass balance is more about the quantity of stuff, not the transport of stuff, but how much of the stuff is in a system, how much of this stuff is in our body, and that is determined by both the input and the output of the system. Okay, so this, again, it can apply to individual compartments, so ions moving in and out of a cell, but it also can apply to an entire organism. Okay, mass balance, this concept explains many physiological phenomena that you'll encounter within A&P, whether you realize it or not. Okay, and as I said in the previous slide, it is related to, but it is not the exact same thing as flow down gradients. So we're still talking about the movement of something, but really how it's transported and how much of it is present are two different things. Okay, so I often tell students that the best way to think about this is the bathtub model. This, again, is a diagram from Silverthorne's text, but it's basically it's called the bathtub model because the input is determines how much stuff is in a system, and it's not just the input, but it's the combination of the input and the output determines how much stuff is in a system. Okay, again, we'll have plenty of time to cover what mass balance is in class. Structure function is another big core concept within the field of physiology, and basically what this means is that the function of a cell, a tissue, or even an organ or an entire organism is determined by its form. Structure dictates function. Okay. So I like to tell students that these two are almost intrinsically linked together, almost always linked together. An example of this, it's difficult to describe function without describing the structure. If you're talking about, well, what's the function of a muscle? And you say, well, muscles contract, but then you have to say, well, what is contraction? You have to explain what contraction is, and in order to do that, you have to explain the structure of a muscle cell. Okay. But basically, to better understand a mechanism, an organism, a tissue, how something works, you need to have some understanding of the structures that are involved. Okay, and I just gave the example of skeletal muscle, and you could then use that understanding, compare it to smooth muscle, the structure of smooth muscle, and make an estimation and make a guess of, oh, it might work similarly because it's structured similarly, but it also could function differently because the structure is slightly different. Okay. We will encounter structure function repeatedly in A&P. All right, so those that I just went through are what I will call the major themes that you'll encounter in physiology. So for the remainder of this, I'm not going to go through the rest of the core concepts, but I do expect you to read through this and familiarize yourself with these concepts, because I'm not saying they won't pop up in our studies, but they just won't pop up as much. Okay, so scientific reasoning is a core concept. Basically, physiology is a science discipline, so scientific reasoning is applied. Okay. Again, I'll leave this to you to come back to at another time or in more depth beyond just this video lecture. Okay. Another concept is cell theory. All cells making up the organism, they have the same DNA. That's the basis of cell theory. applies to many disciplines beyond physiology. Physics and chemistry, I will emphasize on this one that many of the physiological principles that we'll discuss throughout the semester, they depend on physical laws and chemical laws. Okay, so you're not quite finished with your physics and chemistry just because you're in A&P. So physiology is subject to basic laws of the universe, and those include some laws of physics and chemistry. Example, conservation of mass, thermodynamics, those still apply. Genes to proteins, or basically this is the flow of genetic information, how genes are made, transcription, translation, the genetic code, have you. So again, kind of relates to structure function. Central dogma to molecular biology, but we'll encounter it a little bit in physiology. Okay. Levels of organization kind of relates to structure function, but basically understanding physiological function will increase the understanding of behavior at every organization. So really why this is different than structure function, because it gets at understanding the behavior of an entire organism, not just how one system is operating or one part of an organism is operating, but it's how the function dictates or influences behavior. Interdependence, this one, I said that physiology is an integrative discipline, so this one applies probably more so in 242. But it is quite an important core concept. But basically the idea here is that cells, tissues, and organs, they all interact with one another. They're dependent on one another in order to sustain life. And this concept of interdependence really becomes more obvious when we start discussing the nervous system and the cardiovascular system, the respiratory system, and also the renal system. Okay. Basically, we're saying that these systems within the human body, they do not operate in isolation. Causality, we're getting to the end, I promise. Living organisms are causal machines whose functions are explainable by the cause and effect relationships present. Basically, we are interacting with our environment, and our response is dictated by that. Okay. It's a little more abstract than other concepts. Okay. And then the last one I believe that we'll discuss, or that I'll introduce you to, is the idea of evolution. Again, more prominent in other biological disciplines. Mechanism of evolution acts at many levels of organization and results in small adaptive changes that produce relationships between structure and function. Evolution is really tightly integrated with structure function. Okay. All right, so those are the core concepts of physiology. Let's conclude this real quick. So why do I use them? Like I said, I want my students to be more successful in class, but really successful, not just successful in lectures and exams, but beyond the classroom. Okay, additional learning resources. Core concepts to me are an additional learning resource for students. I want to increase your success out of class. I want you to retain these big ideas, even if the details escape you. Okay? These will help you discuss health and disease with many other people, your own peers, your family, your friends. Okay? And some of these could apply to your career in the future, maybe working with patients. Nurse, if you're working in a healthcare environment, some of these big ideas could help you interact with patients and their families and their loved ones. Okay. So what do I expect from my students? I want you to be able to identify these core concepts throughout daily lectures, so even without specific mention by me. I want little light bulbs to go off, like, oh, I think structure function could apply to what we went over in class today. I'll expect you to complete these worksheets not only individually, but also in a small group setting or with a partner. I want you to use the knowledge and the resources that are available to help solve problems and answer questions. I'm trying to get you to connect the dots between all the detail that you're going to encounter in anatomy and physiology, but also take a moment to step back and think about these big ideas and how does the detail fit within these big ideas, these core concepts. All right, so that's your introduction to the core concepts, and I'll see you in class.